anyone that says, oh, this definitely won't happen, Rome Odunze is a big, like 6'3", 220-pound wide receiver. He could test relatively poorly and then suddenly maybe not get all the way to 28, but we know Brandon Beane is not afraid to make an ascension. He's done it in the last 2 first rounds with Kyer Elam and Dalton Kincaid.
This is the Buffalo Plus Podcast, brought to you by Connors and Ferris.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Buffalo Plus YouTube channel here. Dan Fetes alongside, joined by a special guest today that we've wanted to have on the pod and the channel for quite some time. Chris Trapasso, NFL draft and young player analyst from CBS Sports, talking draft because unfortunately the Bill season's over, but we are already looking forward to the draft, free agency, salary cap. We're going to get into all of that. So Chris, I really appreciate your time here today, man.
Dan, thanks for having me. And yes, with the Bills being not continuing to play, not in the Super Bowl, I get for a lot of Bills fans, it's a bummer, but this is still a really fun time of the year, not just free agency, but now we're really starting to get going with this pre-draft process.
I appreciate it. So we'll get into all of that. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe. We are closing in on 30,000 subscribers. You can follow Chris on X or Twitter, whatever you call it, at Chris Trapasso. And also, really good TikTok game. I envy your TikTok game. We got to step up our TikTok game. Maybe we'll talk to you at the combine a little bit. You got a good game, man. I appreciate it. So let's get right into it because I think it's the only position I care about. And I think it's the only position a lot of fans care about. Wide receivers. You just released your first mock draft earlier this week. I was just curious as to how deep is this wide receiver class and where do you see the Bills kind of fitting in that with their need?
Well, if any of your listeners or viewers have paid attention to what I've said the last couple of years, it's going to sound like a broken record. It's a really deep wide receiver class. It's just the state of college football that every team, it seems like, has at least one really good receiver. And a lot of teams are going 2 and 3 and 4 wides relatively often or more often than they had in the past. So some classes have that Jamar Chase at the top of the draft. I think you kind of have that with Marvin Harrison Jr. and Malik Neighbors from LSU. But in that Bills range, like you're mentioning, 28th pick, later in the second round, there are so many quality wide receiver prospects. And I think the ones that fit what the Bills probably want, someone who can play on the outside and win down the football field.
So I was looking at your mock draft. You have Devontae Walker out of UNC going to the Bills at 28. Talk to me a little bit about him because I think a lot of people know, Rome Odunze and Brian Thomas and some of the other big names, Marvin Harrison, some of those guys. I had to look up a little bit about Devontae Walker. So why do you have him going to the Bills and what kind of a prospect is he?
Well, he's exactly what I just described. He is a perimeter wide receiver. He's over 6 foot, around 200 pounds, and was a big play guy at Kent State before he transferred to North Carolina. There were some NCAA problems with his eligibility, was granted that eligibility to play like midway through the season, played in, I think, 7 or 8 games, 41 catches, almost 700 yards and 7 touchdowns. Now, I do think his game is relatively raw. Like you don't see him running routes like Stephon Diggs, getting open in those intricate intermediate or downfield routes. But I think he is going to test very well in the 40 and the vertical at the combine. And Dan, a lot of your viewers and listeners know as well, especially for those skill positions. And then on the other side of the ball at defensive back, the combine really matters. That if you run in the mid 4.5s, you're probably not going in the first round. If you run 4.3, and even if you started at a MAC school and didn't get to play a lot in the ACC like Walker did, you can suddenly be in the consideration for going in the first round. There are, like you mentioned, those big names from the blue blood schools that I think at wide receiver will be picked well ahead of the Bills. But Devontae Walker, with his size, field stretching ability, not amazing after the catch, not Mike Evans in terms of those contested catch situations, but taking the lid off the defense with serious speed and some physicality, that's what Devontae Walker does best.
Little bit of a project then from what you're kind of talking about, raw project.
Yes, a little bit. And so, I mean, relatively early in the pre-draft process, doing those mock drafts, and I do one per week at CBS Sports just because they do so well traffic-wise. I've been cycling through wide receivers. Xavier Worthy from Texas is another one. We can talk about some other receivers as well. But Walker, to me, and he's having a good Senior Bowl from all the reports that I've seen early on this week at practice in Mobile, Alabama. I think, and I saw something yesterday that they have those Zebra technology mile per hour trackers. He had the fastest speed, I think like 21 miles per hour of any of the wide receivers during the first and second day of practices at the Senior Bowl. So again, 6'1", if he runs in the 4.3s, I think those two right there will put him on the Bills' radar at 28 overall. And, which is obviously very important, I think he'll be there at 28 overall.
That's a big key. And that's why your job is so difficult, Chris, because you can be right. You can have all of these things and do all of your research, and the player may not be there, or there's another player that's there. Because as a guy like me, who is, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers, maybe casual college fans that just see the big names, they know who Marvin Harrison Jr. is. Like, is there any chance that Rome Odunze is there, or would the Bills have to move up? And do you have a spot where you're like, there's no way he's not getting past X? Because I think you have him to Jacksonville at 17. You've got two players. Again, this is just your first mock draft.
Sure.
Two players in your top 10, or two wide receivers in your top 10, and then 17 to Jacksonville. You have Brian Thomas going 18, and then Davantez Walker. So is there, if you're sitting there going, hey, those blue blood wide receivers like you're talking about, the Bills need to get to X position in the draft to take him?
Yeah, here's what I would say with the draft, that I've been doing this for a while now, that there's nothing that's too crazy. That we saw Joe Burrow go from a day 3 pick to the number 1 pick. Zach Wilson, same thing. Derwin James, everyone thought he was going to be a top 5 pick. He goes 17 overall. CeeDee Lamb falls to the mid portion of the first round just a few years ago. So anyone that says, oh, this definitely won't happen, Rome Odunze is a big, like 6'3", 220-pound wide receiver. He could test relatively poorly and then suddenly maybe not get all the way to 28, but we know Brandon Beane is not afraid to make an ascension. He's done it in the last 2 first rounds with Kyer Elam and Dalton Kincaid. If Rome Odunze gets to 17, 18, 19, 20, into the early 20s, that would be a point where maybe he doesn't fit the classic definition of being that down the field wide receiver because he's a little slower in terms of how he times at the combine, but how well he plays the football in the air, as you certainly saw at Washington in those high profile games, makes him a downfield threat. So somewhat unlikely that he's still there. But again, with the draft, you can never rule anything out. And maybe other teams will say, hey, look, this is such a deep wide receiver class. Maybe we don't need to pick Rome Odunze in the top 10 or top 15. We can go elsewhere. So I do think there will be, I don't want to say the pick of the litter for the Bills, but more wide receivers available than there were last year when all 4 of those guys went right in front of them before they picked Dalton Kincaid.
That's why you're really good at your job, because I gave you a little bit and you're like, hey, there's nothing too crazy, but like, that's why you're good at your job, Chris. Because I'm sitting there and I go, I'm the type of guy that, again, more casual college fan. Again, I haven't really dove into the draft yet. That's why I wanted to talk to you first before I started before I started to be like, all right, Chris is going to point me in the direction of where I should start looking. It's kind of how I viewed this. And to see that what I like about you too, is that you also are about numbers and you follow analytics. And we've messaged on social media too about just the fact of like pre-snap motion. I just read another one of your article talking about how the Niners are number 1 in pre-snap motion. The Chiefs are number 4. Like all these trends that you're kind of starting to see. Is there a type of player that you would like to see the Bills take because you're seeing, hey, there's a hole in their offense or a hole in their defense that they can address in the first round, whether that's a wide receiver, another player we're talking about, but like, are you sitting there going, they need X type of player in the first round?
That's a fantastic question. And one point before I give my answer on those trends and motioning and play action, we saw in that Bills Chiefs game, it comes down to 1 or 2 plays. Brandon Beane made mention of that. And if some more pre-snap motion, one more explosive play, one more play action play can ultimately be the difference in you losing a game 27-24 or winning when you're in those divisional round and AFC title games. So I think it does matter for the Bills to look for those just tiny little edges, because I think that's right where they are with the Kansas City Chiefs that are kind of building a dynasty. The Bills have been right there, been leading late in games and haven't been able to close it out in the playoffs. I don't think they can only pick X type of wide receiver. But, and Sean McDermott spoke to this as well, so this is not just speculation from me, I was the biggest proponent of the Bills needed to be better after the catch. In 2021 and 2022, they were last and second to last in the league in yards after the catch per reception. You see the Dolphins, you see the Chiefs, 49ers have led that category 6 straight seasons, which is incredible. The Bills got better in that regard. They were like right in the middle of the pack, but the explosive plays came down, that they had to kind of play small ball later in the season and certainly in that playoff game against the Chiefs. And for as much as Josh Allen has proven that he can be that type of quarterback, to not have, John Brown and Cole Beasley and then Gabe Davis taking the lid off of defense, Stephon Diggs maybe losing a quarter or a half of a step, not being as much of a deep threat, you saw what it did to the limitations of this Bills offense, that they weren't able to really threaten defenses at all 3 levels. So I would lean toward more of a vertical threat. They have slot guys, someone who can probably fill the void that will likely be left by Gabe Davis leaving in free agency.
Yeah, it'd be great to see a guy that, it's funny because I was big on Jameson Williams last year, and I remember talking to him at the combine, and I think it was Mike Rodak asked the question of like, how fast would you have run? And he was like, the fastest. And they were like, what? And he was like, whatever anybody runs, I ran faster than them. And that was the greatest answer. Like, again, I do think that like those explosive plays, because you saw the Chiefs game, they had 8 plays of 20 plus yards. The Bills had none. Like that's massive. Any other wide receivers that you just want to mention? I know you're going to cycle them through. Like, I'd love to hear your take on them.
Okay, you mentioned Brian Thomas from LSU and Malik Neighbors. Again, we don't know what's going to happen, but he's most likely going to be a top 10 or top 15 pick. Brian Thomas, though, is really interesting because he kind of hits both of those styles of wide receivers that I was mentioning. He's listed at 6'4", 205. Awesome in contested catch situations. Yeah, he kind of fits the mold of that bigger body wide receiver. But what I like about Brian Thomas, and what you kind of mentioned, is there a specific wide receiver I think the Bills should kind of lean toward? I like the fact that he's not 6'4", 230. It's kind of like the NFL has gone away from those bigger bodies. I know Mike Evans is still producing into his 30s, but smaller, more sudden, more sleek athletes at the wide receiver spot are kind of trending in the right direction for the NFL. 6'4", 205, might be 210. Very fluid athlete, very good after the catch, catches everything. He's really interesting. We'll see how he tests. He's relatively young. He's only going to be 21 in his rookie season. And one other name, Alabama's Jermaine Burton. Now, he's probably not one that you'll see in a lot of first rounds, but he was at Alabama. He started his career at Georgia, produced at Georgia. And what I like about it is, with Justin Shorter last year when the Bills picked him, it was like, oh, he started his career at Penn State, never really amounted to anything, went to Florida, played well. Jermaine Burton was good at Georgia, decided to transfer to Alabama, and was also very productive there. So he proved it at 2 different schools, 2 different situations, quarterbacks, offensive schemes. He got down the field. Again, very, very good catching the football, tracking it over his shoulder. He has what I wrote in my scouting grade book is just easy speed. It's kind of like Marquise Goodwin back in the day with the Bills. Like, doesn't look it looks effortless. It does not look taxing on his body when he's getting down the football field. And what I think the Bills will like, not that the Bills are a run-heavy team or want to be, he is a very good blocker on the outside. And he's someone not going to create a lot after the catch, a little bit of a smaller frame, will probably be around 5'11", 180, 190 pounds, kind of in that Stephon Diggs range. But Jermaine Burton is really interesting to me. And one other one really quickly that you're going to see in a lot of mock drafts, Oregon's Troy Franklin. Watch his film, watch the highlights, down the field, and I'll kind of finish with this. He gave me Justin Jefferson vibes. I don't want to say he's the next Justin Jefferson, but he's very uniquely built like Justin Jefferson. He's listed at 6'3", like 190. So it seems kind of skinny, but he's still pretty tall. Great after the catch, the wiggle that you need, the lateral ability, not very physical. And there are some concentration drops, but in terms of just flipping on those afterburners down the field, tracking it over his shoulder, even in traffic. He did that for multiple seasons at Oregon. Those 3, late first round, they probably would not have to trade up for either 3 of those. And with Jermaine Burton, they could probably trade back into the second and still get him the exact type of, I guess, prototype that I was referencing. They can play on the perimeter, and major programs prove that they can be that down the field threat.
Love that. I just wrote down all 3 of those names because I'm going to look at them afterwards, because this is great. Like, this is what I'm talking about, where the fact of it's also, can Burton play? It's so tricky because you also have to figure out where Khalil Shakir is going to set up in this offense, correct? Like if you think of Shakir as just your slot guy, then you really need a guy that can play outside. Now, if you think Shakir can do both, right, Chris, then all of a sudden you're looking for another hybrid as well. Kind of tricky, right? Like you kind of got to make I always go back to it. I always get frustrated when for years, I know it was Sean McDermott wanted to have this physical style of offense, but then you didn't have a physical offensive line and you didn't have a running back that could run physically. And to me, it's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Like I think the Bills found identity this year. I just would like them to continue it with Joe Brady of saying, hey, look, this is what you do. This is what you do. This is what we need this person to come in and do. Fair?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think on that, where the wide receivers line up, I certainly Joe Brady and Sean McDermott know more of the intricacies, 50 times more about the intricacies of the Bills offense than I do. But when you watch a Bills game, Stephon Diggs motions into the slot. He's sometimes on the perimeter. Gabe Davis would occasionally play in the slot. There's only like a very select few wide receivers. Like Cole Beasley was a slot only wide receiver. You barely ever saw him on the perimeter. Shakir can play on the outside. He can play mostly on the inside. So I don't think it needs to be like, don't get too bogged down with, hey, this guy's only in the slot, only on the outside. Again, with the size that we've seen at receiver get smaller and lighter, Tank Dell can play on the outside, Deontay Johnson inside, outside. It doesn't necessarily, it's not as much contingent upon, hey, how tall are you and how much do you weigh? And I do think Joe Brady, given what he did with all those receivers at LSU, will certainly move around the wide receivers next season for the Bills.
Love it. Sleepers. I know you kind of gave a few of them, but I always love this. It's like, hey, give me a day 2 guy. Give me a day 3 guy that I know Mike was big on Tank Dell last year. Like just some of these guys where we're like, hey, he kind of pops. Is there anybody that you see that could slip because of injury, college, great, like anything that you could see as a guy that, hey, on days 2 and 3, keep an eye out for that?
There's 2 that fit what we've been talking about. We're mostly more perimeter. And again, they can kind of switch around, but that played on the outside and can get down the field and made big plays. Javon Baker from UCF. The Bills obviously have a history with Gabe Davis from UCF. I'm not sure if the coaching staff is exactly the same as it was in 2020 there, but averaged over 17 yards per catch, started his career in the SEC, transferred. I believe he was at Alabama first, transferred to UCF and looked like an Alabama receiver playing in that conference, tracks it very well. There's a lot of receivers that just over the shoulder catches, body control, getting their feet in bounds, kind of like Gabe Davis did with the Bills. Yes, they could certainly use that. Again, they didn't have that from Davis this season on a consistent basis. So Javon Baker from UCF, and a name that people will certainly know, kind of raise your eyebrows, Brendan Rice, who is Jerry Rice's son at USC, started at Colorado before Deion got there, transfers to USC, played with Caleb Williams last season. Another one, over 16 yards per catch. And I think, of course, he's not his dad, but he runs good routes. But then at times you're like, okay, he's just going to be that chain mover. He'd hit a 50-yard touchdown on a post route. So I think he's going to test pretty well. Maybe not 4.3 with a 42-inch vertical, but day 2 you mentioned, I think Brendan Rice could be in the mix. And one other name, if we're just going to totally forget about where do they need to align, and maybe Joe Brady can convince Brandon Beane, I just need playmakers, Ainias Smith from Texas A&M. He was there for a long time, 4 seasons, and was good right from his freshman season on. Kind of is like a bigger, stockier version of Deontay Hardy. And I know he wasn't used a lot in Buffalo, had a disappointing season, but is that water bug Tank Dell type that changes direction in a flash, was great as a kick and punt returner, and that translates when he's getting open and after the catch. So if the Bills are like, hey, look, we just want more weapons, Ainias Smith, 5'9", 190 pounds, 185, 190 pounds, which 10 years ago would be like, oh, you're way too small, you're going to be a seventh rounder. Right. Now I think he could be in that day 2 mix where if the Bills do go defensive tackle or safety in the first round and wait at wide receiver, and I think they should pick a receiver before the end of the second round, Ainias Smith, more of a slot type, but very dynamic with the football in his hands, can hit those explosive plays.
I have always created a bunch of memes of I'm team wide receiver, all this stuff. Yes. And then it was like, hey, I'm team running back. And then it was like, I'm team playmaker. I am team anybody. I just look at all of these guys around the league, and it's like the NBA has become so much more positionless. You're starting to see that a little bit too, where the good offensive coordinators can just get playmakers the ball in space. It doesn't matter. Like, again, I think Joe Brady did a great job with Dalton Kincaid. Like, don't just look at him as just a tight end. Like, look at him as a playmaker and how you can use him in the offense. Moving on, just real quick, just one quick question. The Bills have one defensive tackle under contract heading into next year. They will obviously add to it with free agency. Is there anybody in the draft that you like? Because they have to address D-line and they have to address safety too, to some respects as well. They have to get younger at those two positions.
For sure.
Is there anybody that you like? I know it's early in the process, but any defensive tackles, safeties that, hey, this guy is Sean McDermott-esque. Anybody that wrestled? Like, do we know that yet?
I should know that. I haven't seen anyone that at defensive tackle, but that will come up, and I'm sure some of these guys do. There's two names at defensive tackle. Tavondre Sweat from Texas is the name that Bills fans are going to hear a lot about. Like 6'4", 6'5", like 360. So he is that one technique next to Ed Oliver that would complement Oliver well, and what the Bills have seemingly liked to have next to Ed Oliver, who is, sub 300 pounds at defensive tackle, and McKinley Jackson from Texas A&M. The one thing I would say, like philosophically about the draft, this is not to say that I think defensive tackle is not important. And certainly in Buffalo, with how Sean McDermott likes to rotate the defensive line, I think it matters. Yeah. But to me, I think later, 4th, 5th, 6th round, you can get a big body who can eat blockers and make a few plays in the backfield, or at least disrupt the backfield. And to not get too bogged down on, they need this one or that one or this guy. It's kind of like the running back of the defense to me, where defensive tackle, there's a bunch of 315 plus pound prospects every year in the draft. As long as the Bills address it and maybe not considerably early, then I would be totally fine. And really in whatever direction they go. At safety, there's two at the top where, again, I kind of just mentioned that the Bills could go safety in the first round. Sean McDermott could say, look, we're probably going to, or at that point, I think Micah Hyde will probably not be on the team, whether he retires or whatever. And Jordan Poyer said he wants to stay, but is he going to have to take a pay cut? What's going to happen with him? Even given his age, they'll probably address safety, like you mentioned. Yeah. Cameron Kinchins from Miami is the most Sean McDermott in the class, like right around 6 foot, 200 plus pounds, did everything at Miami. I know that defense wasn't great. They've kind of been disappointing over the last couple seasons, but athleticism, instincts, you see him on film. He's the first player moving to the football. Like when it's a pass play, he reads route concepts, great blitzer. And certainly the Bills showed this season with McDermott calling the plays. They like to blitz safeties and slot corners a lot more than they did under Leslie Frazier. And Tyler Nubin from Minnesota, another one, more of a free safety type. So maybe that would fit more of what Micah Hyde, that role that he kind of fell into later in his career. And I know the Bills were interchangeable with their safeties, but Hyde was mostly further away from the line of scrimmage, better range in coverage from Tyler Nubin. But those are the two that very well could be there at 28. If the Bills don't love the receivers, I could see them going in that direction, given Sean McDermott as the head coach. That's why you are here on Buffalo Plus. Chris Trapasso, the best at just breaking down the film. Again, TikTok, he also does a great job of just, you're in your lab and just eating tape. You're just eating tape, going through it. I love it. So I really appreciate that. I was on my phone, and it wasn't because I was distracted. I wanted to bring up the tweets because we will talk more about the draft maybe after the combine. We're going to meet up at the combine. We're both going there. And I want to talk about that. I also want to talk a little bit, maybe we'll know a little bit more after talking to or hearing from Joe Brady or Bobby Babich, because I saw you also had some takes on play calling and the defense, things like that. Sure. That could be for another day. But I really want to talk on a couple of things. I consider you, Chris, a salary cap truther. I consider that that the salary cap is not 100% real. And I was just looking at some of your tweets. You said back in 2002, the fact that NFL teams can add voidable years to contracts is a prime example of why the salary cap is not real. You also tweeted, remember that basically anything can fit under the salary cap. You get it. You get it. And I know there will be a lot of talk, and we will talk to Brandon Beane at the combine and be like, hey, man, you're so much over the cap. There's just nothing you can do. There's just nothing you can do. Explain that the Bills can still do things. That like this isn't. Now, I'm not saying they're going to be big spenders and make another Von Miller type deal, but the Bills can still go out there and add players if need be. Correct? Yeah, absolutely. And what you just pointed out, I think, is how I believe the salary cap to be in terms of the modern NFL. Brandon Beane recently said, like, oh, no, it's definitely real. You're never going to get a GM at the combine or at a press conference saying, oh, it's fake. we can just spend however we want. Like, they're going to always say that. And I think eventually, whether that's in 2027 or 2028, 2029, whether it's Brandon Beane, whoever, yeah, like, you have to ultimately pay those players extra money, dead cap down the road. But if you are a team with an elite quarterback, and to me, Josh Allen is the second best quarterback in the NFL. Yep. Better than anyone else. Like, it's Patrick Mahomes and then Josh Allen in terms of what he is capable and has shown he can do on a football field. When you have him at 27, turning 28, you push everything to the future. And that doesn't mean be totally fiscally irresponsible, but it will be very easy for the Bills to get under the salary cap and be able to add lower level free agents. The one thing that I was telling a friend last offseason when it was, the Bills don't have a lot of money. Now, they were in a better situation before free agency than they were now. They don't need to sign another huge splash free agent. They have a really good team. They have the stars at multiple positions. They've had all pros on defense, in the secondary, at wide receiver, at corner, at quarterback. So it's not a team that's like the teams that are rebuilding and that that we'll pick in the top 10 or 15. Yeah, those are the teams that need those big splashy free agent signings to fill out their roster. The Bills already have those on their roster. Some restructures, a few pay cuts, a few cuts. It's not going to be an issue when it comes to free agency. Brandon Beane has shown an ability to bring in veterans on one-year deals, like Leonard Floyd was such a great signing, trading for Rasul Douglas. Daquan Jones a few years ago was a great signing. Finding guys off the street like Isaiah McKenzie and Jordan Phillips. There really should be, I think, almost minimal concern in terms of what the Bills can do with their salary cap, as long as they have Josh Allen and that you can still add void years and the salary cap continues to raise, and the Bills are going to have 10 draft picks. So they can get all of those players, cheap, young talent on the roster for, relatively inexpensively on their books.
I always joke around that the salary cap isn't GMs and cheap owners use it as an excuse.
Yes. Great point.
Jenna made the comparison and I thought it was great. She talked about dating and she goes, it's something that girls talk about. If he could, he would. Like, hey, if the guy wanted to call you, like I always say, if the Bills wanted to keep this player, a player around, they'd find a way. They just would find a way. Like if the Bills really wanted Tremaine Edmonds last year, they would have found a way. Like they say it's the salary cap. I just don't think they were really in that direction. And to the salary cap point of how strapped they were this year and things like that, they were still paying Trey White, who only played 4 games. They didn't have Matt Milano. They were also paying Von Miller, who wasn't himself. Like there are other pieces that are coming back. I was looking at it. Like the middle linebacker position is going to be insane next year with Milano and Tremaine Edmonds. And Terrell Bernard. Like, so like, again, I do think that that's a great point, and I just loved your opinion. And I go, it was part of like having you on to be like, hey, by the way, like the Bills will be fine. And again, they can restructure, and they have an owner that is willing to pay out and cut checks. That's huge. Yes. And while they're in the mix, I'm with you. So I appreciate it as always, Chris Trapasso at Chris Trapasso. Follow him at CBS Sports. He is the NFL draft and young players analyst. We will meet up at the combine. Chris, appreciate it as always. I'm going to go look up a bunch of these players. I wrote them all down. All right, definitely. And all the viewers, listeners, watch the highlights, but then go back and watch maybe a cut up full game of Troy Franklin just to get a sense that he's not a perfect player, but there are a lot of those, again, vertical field stretchers that I think Sean McDermott, Brandon Beane, and certainly Joe Brady are going to have their eyes on in this pre-draft process. Appreciate it as always. I'll catch up with you in Indy. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, follow Chris, all of his mock drafts, everything there. Appreciate it as always, Chris. We'll catch up again soon. Thanks, Dan.
Buffalo Plus, your interactive look at the week in football, brought to you by Connors and Ferris.